There are relationships that don't break all at once. They thin, the way fabric thins at the elbows, until one day the light comes through. Marcus and Renata had built something that looked, from most angles, like a life. A mortgage in his name, a daughter from his previous marriage who called Renata by her first name and meant it warmly, and a routine that had settled into them the way sediment settles into riverbed. What neither of them examined closely enough was how much of what they called love had become logistics: who paid which bill, whose name sat on which account, whose past had quietly become the other's leverage. The tension was never loud. It lived in the spaces between sentences, in the particular way Renata changed the subject when Marcus mentioned his ex-wife, in the way Marcus noticed but said nothing, because saying nothing had always felt like keeping the peace. This is a story about what happens to a home when one person quietly decides it belongs entirely to them, and what a father finds waiting at the door when he finally comes home. The coffee maker started at 6014 every morning, and Marcus had never once programmed it. That was Renata's doing, one of those small domestic installations she'd made in the first year, when the apartment on Clover Street had still felt temporary, and she'd been trying, in her quiet and practical way, to make it permanent. Now they lived in the house on Deerfield Road, the one Marcus had bought with the insurance money after his mother passed, and the coffee maker still started at 6014, because nobody had changed it and nobody had thought to. He came downstairs on a Tuesday in mid-October wearing the same gray Henley he'd worn the night before, his left shoulder stiff from the way he'd slept. Sophie's backpack was by the door, pink with an iron-on patch of a horse she'd picked out at a craft fair 2 summers ago, and the sound of cartoons came from the living room at a volume just low, enough that Renata hadn't called out to turn it down. "She eat?" Marcus asked. Renata was at the counter with her phone, scrolling. "Toast. She didn't want the eggs." "She never wants the eggs." "I know." He poured his coffee and stood beside her for a moment, close enough that their arms almost touched. There was nothing hostile in the distance between them. That was the thing about how they'd gotten here. It hadn't been hostility. It had been accommodation, repeated until accommodation became the relationship itself. Sophie appeared in the doorway in her school clothes, one sock on, one in her hand. She was 9, and she had Marcus's ears and her mother's eyes, and she moved through the world with a kind of cheerful self-possession that Marcus privately found miraculous, given the years she'd had. "Dad, will you be home when I get back?" "I've got a double," he said, "but I'll text you when I'm leaving." Sophie absorbed this the way children absorb things they've absorbed before, with a small nod that was less disappointment than habit. She'd grown up around his shifts. 14 years as a paramedic had given Marcus's schedule a shape that everyone in his life had eventually bent themselves around. "Renata will be here," Renata said, not looking up from her phone. Sophie found her other sock and sat on the bottom stair to put it on. Marcus watched her and felt the usual pull, the specific tenderness of watching your child do something ordinary, and then he set his mug in the sink and went to find his jacket. He and Renata didn't kiss goodbye. They hadn't in some time. There had been a period, maybe 3 years ago, when that kind of small contact had been consistent, nearly reflexive, her fingers on his arm, his mouth at her temple. But it had faded the way those things fade, not through argument, but through inattention. He'd noticed. He suspected she had too. Neither of them had said so. The morning was cold and clear, the maples on Deerfield already past their peak color. He sat in his truck for a moment before starting the engine, the way he sometimes did, not thinking anything in particular, just pausing. There was a word he'd read once in some article a colleague had shared, for the feeling of being inside your own life and somehow also outside it. He hadn't remembered the word. He just remembered the feeling. He backed out of the driveway and drove toward the station, and the house sat quiet behind him, and Renata stood at the kitchen window until he turned the corner, and then she looked down at her phone again. And the conversation she'd been having, the one that had nothing to do with coffee or eggs or Sophie's backpack, continued. The double shift ended at 11:40 at night. Marcus sat in the station break room for 20 minutes after the last call, drinking water and staring at the table. There'd been a bad one around 4 in the afternoon. A man in his 60s, cardiac event in a restaurant parking lot, wife screaming in a language Marcus didn't speak, the particular quality of helplessness that the job produced in him when everything went right, and it still wasn't enough. The man had made it to the hospital. Marcus didn't know what had happened after that. He rarely did. His partner, Dwight, clapped him on the shoulder on the way out. "You okay?" "Yeah." "You're not." "No," Marcus agreed, "but I will be." This was one of the truths of his life. He processed things slowly, privately, and mostly alone. Renata had once said this was why she never knew what he was thinking. He'd said gently that she could ask. She'd said she didn't want to have to. It had been one of those conversations that revealed something real and then closed over it, like water closing over a stone. He texted her from the parking lot. "On my way." She didn't respond, which wasn't unusual. She went to bed by 10. He texted Sophie, "Coming home, Bear. You're asleep, but I'll check on you." Sophie had had his old phone for a year now, with parental controls and a bedtime lock that kicked in at 9. The message would be there in the morning. He drove home through streets that were mostly empty, the radio on low, and he thought about the man in the parking lot. And then he thought about his own father, who died of the same thing at 61, and then he thought about nothing, which was a skill he'd developed over years of needing it. He turned onto Deerfield Road at 12:20 and saw the porch light on. He saw Sophie. She was sitting on the front step with her knees pulled up and her coat zipped to her chin, her backpack beside her, and she was awake. At 12:20 in the morning, on a school night, sitting outside, he stopped the truck in the driveway and got out before he'd fully processed what he was seeing, and Sophie looked up at him with an expression he would not be able to describe afterward. Not fear. Not quite, but a careful steadiness, the face of a child who has decided to be very calm about something frightening. "Sophie, why are you outside?" "The key doesn't work," she said. He looked at the door, then back at her. "What do you mean it doesn't work?" "I've been trying. It just doesn't turn." She stood up, brushing something off her coat. "I called you, but I think your phone was on silent. I was going to call Mom, but I didn't want to wake her up." His ex-wife, Claire, lived 40 minutes away. Sophie stayed with him on weekdays and alternated weekends, an arrangement that had been amicable for 3 years and occasionally wasn't. Marcus went to the door with his own key. It didn't turn. He stood there for a moment, the key in the lock, the porch light buzzing faintly overhead, the neighborhood asleep around them. He tried again. Nothing. The lock had been changed. He was holding a key to a door that was no longer his door's lock, and his 9-year-old daughter had been sitting outside on a 40-degree night for, he looked at her, "How long have you been out here?" "Since like 9:30, she said. "I came home from Josie's and it didn't work." An hour before Sophie's phone locked. 2.5 hours before he'd come home. He looked at the front windows. The downstairs lights were off. Upstairs, Renata's room, their room, showed the faint bar of light under the curtain that meant she was awake or had fallen asleep with the lamp on. He called her. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called again. She picked up on the 3rd ring, her voice even and unsurprised. "Marcus, Renata, Sophie's been locked outside since 9:30. A pause. "I know." The word "no" landed in a way that took him a moment to locate. Not, "Oh God," or "what," or "Is she okay?" Just, "I know." Flat, and already past the surprise of it. "You H-y." He stopped, looked at Sophie, who was watching him with that careful steadiness. "Open the door. I don't think that's a good idea tonight." "Renata, my daughter is outside in the cold." "Open the door." Another pause, longer. "There's a lot we need to talk about, Marcus. Not tonight. Not right now." He pulled the phone from his ear and looked at it. And for a moment he was aware of how the scene must look from outside itself. A man standing on a front porch he apparently no longer had access to, his daughter beside him, the night around them. And there was something about that awareness, that sudden sense of being observed, that made him very quiet. "You know," he said to Sophie, not into the phone, half to himself, "maybe tell someone about this. Share this story or something." He shook his head. I don't know why I said that. Sophie looked at him. Are you okay, Dad? No, he said. But I will be. He called Claire. She answered on the second ring, already awake in the way parents of shared custody children learn to stay awake, and he explained briefly and carefully, and she said she was on her way. And he sat on the front step beside his daughter and put his arm around her, and they waited. Claire arrived at 1015 in her old Subaru, and she had the good sense not to make it complicated. She took Sophie, who had finally started to fall asleep against Marcus's shoulder, and buckled her into the back seat. And then she looked at Marcus with the tired, unsentimental eyes of someone who had known him in a way Renata never had. You need to not be here tonight, Claire said. I know. Whatever this is, don't have it on a porch at 1 in the morning with Sophie in the back seat. I know, he said again. She drove away and he stood on the sidewalk and looked at the house, and then he went to his truck and slept there, upright, until the gray early light came through the windshield and the neighbor's dog began to bark. He rang the bell at 7. Renata answered it wearing the robe she bought in Portland on the trip they'd taken for her birthday 3 years ago, and she looked like herself, unhurried, collected. The particular composure she wore the way some people wore armor. I made coffee, she said. He came inside. The living room was the same, and it was not the same. There were boxes, 3 of them, against the far wall, and they had his name on them in black marker, his books, his work bag, the framed photograph of Sophie that had sat on the mantel since they moved in. He looked at the boxes. He looked at Renata. How long? He asked. She sat in the armchair, her armchair, the one she'd bought herself and brought here, and held her mug in both hands. I've been thinking about it for a while. That's not an answer. 8 months. She met his eyes without flinching. Actively. Before that. Longer. 8 months. He'd had a version of this thought himself, the awareness that something was ending, but he'd housed it in a future tense, always will be, rather than is. He understood now that she had moved past the future tense without him. The house is in my name, he said. I know. Her voice didn't change. I've spoken to someone about that. Someone? An attorney. He sat down across from her, not because he wanted to, but because he needed to. The boxes were in his peripheral vision. Outside, a car passed, and a dog barked, the same neighbor's dog, and the morning continued at its own indifferent pace. You locked Sophie outside, he said. I didn't think she'd be back before you. She was at Josie's. She comes home from Josie's at 9. She's been doing that for 2 years. Something moved across Renata's face. Not guilt exactly, but a recognition of the fact that he'd just said something true. She didn't answer. That's my daughter, he said. Whatever is happening between us, she's 9 years old and she was outside in the cold for 2.5 hours. I know, her voice had dropped slightly. I didn't intend for that. What did you intend? She looked at her mug. I've been carrying this for a long time, Marcus. You're not home. You're never home. When you are, you're somewhere else. I've been in this house more than you have for 3 years. You've been planning to take it. She looked up. I've been surviving. There's a difference. He thought about whether there was and found that he couldn't decide. That was the thing about Renata. She was not wrong in the ways he'd have preferred. She'd been lonely. He'd known she'd been lonely. He'd told himself it was a phase, that he'd find a way to be more present, that the job was just hard right now and it would ease. It hadn't eased. You could have told me, he said. I did. You didn't listen. You could have told me you were done. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't know how to say it. So I handled it the way I handle things, by changing the locks, by taking control of something. She set her mug down. I'm not proud of all of it. He believed her. That was its own kind of difficult. You're not keeping this house, he said. Not legally, not any other way. I'll get it sorted. You'll have time to find somewhere. She nodded, and the nod was quiet and accepting, and he wondered if she'd known it would go this way, and had made her peace with it before this conversation. He stood up. He didn't take the boxes. He'd come back for those. "I'm sorry," she said as he reached the door. "For Sophie, that was wrong." He stood with his hand on the frame. "Yeah," he said. "It was." He didn't say anything else. By February, Renata was renting an apartment in Millhaven, the nicer part of town, with tall windows and wood floors, and a kitchen she'd told her friend Dara was actually mine, finally. Dara had nodded and said something supportive. Renata had gone home and stood in the kitchen for a while, feeling the particular quality of a quiet she hadn't expected. She'd rebuilt the story, the way people do. Not dishonestly, exactly. She'd been lonely, and that was true. And Marcus had been absent, and that was true. What she excised, gradually and without quite intending to, was the timeline. The 8 months of quiet planning. The consultations with the attorney about adverse possession and tenancy rights, which had gone nowhere but which she'd pursued with a focus she hadn't brought to much else. The lock change, which she'd done on a Sunday afternoon with a YouTube tutorial and a kit from the hardware store, while Sophie was at a friend's house. She'd told herself when she did it that Marcus would find somewhere to stay and they'd deal with things in the morning. She told herself she hadn't really thought Sophie would be there. Mostly this was true. Partly it was the kind of truth that leaves out the part where you didn't check. She was not a villain in her own mind, because almost no one is. She was a woman who had wanted something, stability, ownership, a place that was fully hers, and had pursued it with more ruthlessness than she'd been willing to acknowledge until afterward. She'd been wrong too. That was also real. The problem with the story she told herself was not that it was false. It was that it was incomplete. She thought about Sophie sometimes, the image of her on that front step. She didn't reach out. Marcus, by February, had settled into the house on Deerfield with a kind of deliberate attention he hadn't paid it before. He repainted the kitchen, a project he'd been putting off for 2 years, and he fixed the gate latch, and he started cooking actual meals, not the reheated things he'd been assembling at midnight after shifts. Sophie came home on Tuesdays and Thursdays and alternating weekends, and she put her horse patch back by the door, and the house had the shape of a life being lived in. He went to a therapist once a week on Thursday evenings. This was something he'd resisted for years in the way men resist things that require them to say precisely what they feel. The therapist's name was Wendell, and he had the particular gift of asking questions that seemed simple and weren't, and Marcus found himself, over several months, examining the ways he'd learned to be absent, from his first marriage, from Renata, from his own life. Not as accusation, but as information. He was not over it. He didn't know what being over it would look like. He knew that he'd gotten home late one night in January and found Sophie already asleep, and he'd stood in her doorway and felt, not for the first time, the precise weight of what could have been different. Not Renata. Renata had been in his life for 4 years and would now not be, and that had its own weight. But Sophie, alone on a step in the dark, that one he couldn't set down cleanly. He didn't hate Renata. He'd tried on hatred, the way you try on something that doesn't quite fit, and found it exhausting. What he had instead was something quieter and more durable, a clear understanding of what she was capable of, and a decision, arrived at without drama, not to be near it. Spring came, and he planted something in the backyard for the first time. Tomatoes, badly, following instructions from a video, and Sophie helped, and they were terrible at it. And she laughed at the crooked stakes, and the afternoon had the specific texture of a life reforming itself, slowly and without announcement. They saw each other once more in June. It was at the farmer's market on Clement Street, which they'd both gone to on Saturday mornings when they were together and apparently still went to separately. He saw her at the bread stand, her hair longer than when they'd been together, her attention on a loaf of sourdough she was turning in her hands. She hadn't seen him yet. He considered leaving. He bought apples from the stand beside the bread stand, and when he turned, she was looking at him. Neither of them did anything dramatic. There was no grand confrontation prepared in either of them. They were both tired people who had been something to each other and were now something else. standing in Saturday morning light with their respective purchases. "Hi," she said. "Hi." She looked well. He thought that neutrally, without pain, the way you note the weather. She had that same composure, that self-containment he'd spent 4 years trying to decide if it was strength or something harder. "How's Sophie? She's good," he said. "She's good." Renata nodded. Her hands were still holding the bread. I think about that night sometimes." He was quiet. "I want you to know She stopped. Something shifted in her face. Something that had the shape of an apology but couldn't quite form into words. "I wasn't thinking clearly about what I was doing." To her. "I know," he said. Not that it's okay. Not that he forgave it. Just, I know. The acknowledgement of a fact. She looked at him with an expression he'd seen only once or twice in 4 years. The expression she had when the composure dropped slightly, when something real came up through it like a light through water. "Do you think you could have, if things had been different?" "I don't know," he said. And then, because it was true and he'd worked hard to be honest about things, "Maybe if I'd been more present, maybe if you'd talked to me before you'd already decided." He paused. "I'm not sure those two things could have both happened." She understood what he meant. He could see that she did. "I'm doing better," she said. "I have my own place. She smiled, small and slightly sad. "It's quiet." "That's what you wanted." "Part of it," she said. "Part of it." There was a long moment between them, not uncomfortable, just the silence of two people standing at the end of something with nothing left to negotiate. "Take care of yourself, Renata. You too." He walked away through the market, past the flowers and the honey and the woman selling ceramic bowls, and he didn't look back. And she watched him go for a moment, and then looked down at the bread in her hands and held it for a while before setting it down and walking toward nothing in particular. Sophie found the tomatoes in August. They'd grown improbably given how badly they'd been planted. 3 of them, small and imperfect, one of them split on one side where it had grown too fast. She held one up to show him, standing in the backyard in the afternoon light, and the look on her face was so straightforwardly delighted that he stood there and let himself feel it, the good, plain weight of a life continuing. "We should plant more next year," she said. "Probably," he said. "We'll do it better." "Probably not," he said. "But we'll try." She put the tomato in the bowl they brought out, and the 2 of them went inside, and the door closed behind them. And the afternoon light continued in the yard without them, warming the split tomatoes, the crooked stakes, the small and improbable evidence of things that had grown in spite of everything. Some things end the way water ends on dry ground. Not with a sound, but with a slow disappearing, until you can't quite say where it went. Marcus and Renata had not been a great love story. They had been 2 people who had needed things the other couldn't consistently provide, and who had handled that need with varying degrees of grace and damage. What remained for both of them was quieter than what had come before, a clear understanding of their own shapes, the knowledge of what they were capable of, and the daily work of doing better with what was left. It is not a triumphant ending, but it is an honest one.